Welcome back to BYoungMinistry.com, to another blog and to another podcast. Today we continue in our study of the Gospel according to Mark. We're in chapter 6, verses 46 through 52, which reads, "After sending them away, he went into the hills to pray. That night the boat was in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on the land. He saw his followers struggling hard to row the boat because the wind was blowing against them. Between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came to them, walking on the water, and he wanted to walk past the boat. But when they saw him walking on the water, they thought he was a ghost and cried out. They all saw him and were afraid. But quickly Jesus spoke to them and said, 'Have courage, it is I, do not be afraid.' Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind became calm. The followers were greatly amazed. They did not understand about the miracle of the 5 loaves because their minds were closed." That's Mark chapter 6, verses 46 through 52. Today we continue in our study of Mark 6, where the disciples are being taught by the Lord Jesus. We cannot understand today's passage until we see it as a trial given to the disciples after the feeding of the 5,000. One goes with the other. One builds on the other. In verse 46 of today's passage, we read, "After sending them away, he went into the hills to pray." Essential to ministry, anything spiritual in our lives, is prayer. After the Lord sent the huge crowd back to their homes, he went up into the hills to pray. Prayer is the breath of the Christian life. And because almost nothing decays so fast in the fallen human heart as the desire to talk to God, we must recognize the battle and make it our habit to talk with the Father about all things as often in a given day as possible. Nothing is more vital than prayer, and few things are more vulnerable to neglect. The disciples of the Lord Jesus had been successful in ministry, and right on the heels of that success, they discovered they could not feed the 5,000 men on the side of a hill next to the Sea of Galilee. It was in that important moment they were at their best, but they felt different. They felt like losers. We are at our best when we are most convinced that we need God. We could say that we are at our worst when we're not convinced that we need God, or that we can depend upon ourselves, or anything that we might have to depend upon. In verses 47 and 48 of today's passage, we read, "That night the boat was in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on the land. He saw his followers struggling hard to row the boat because the wind was blowing against them. Between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came to them, walking on the water, and he wanted to walk past the boat." Right on the heels of yet another miracle performed by the Lord Jesus, the disciples find themselves in another intense trial. This test, like all of our trials, was designed of the Lord to deepen the disciples' intimacy with himself. And this time, he was not with them in the boat. He had sent them out alone, and he went up into the hills to pray. In like manner, the storms of our lives are made up of these same 2 elements: trouble and the seeming absence of the Lord. The storm arrived when the disciples were at the most vulnerable spot on the lake, in the middle of it. And as the storm blew in at the darkest moment in the night, the Lord Jesus came to them walking on the water. Long before the disciples saw the Lord Jesus coming on the water, he saw them in their struggle. We often ask, Lord, where are you in this while we are in the middle of our trials? It is imperative that we struggle with such questions. Absence does make the heart grow fonder. Absence, or seeming absence, makes us seek more. When the disciples saw the Lord Jesus, they were scared, thinking he was a ghost. At the end of verse 48, he wanted to walk past the boat. The Lord would have gone past the disciples, but he did not. If he had, the disciples would have been given a more staggering view of God. But that didn't happen because their fear was too great and their faith in the God of the Bible was too small. We miss out on much that God has for us because he, in our view, is smaller than our storms. To see him from that more staggering vantage point is a great blessing. In order to have that view, we must be willing and vulnerable enough to run greater risks. In verses 49 and 50 of today's passage, we read, "But when they saw him walking on the water, they saw he was a ghost and cried out. They all saw him and were afraid, but quickly Jesus spoke to them and said, 'Have courage, it is I. Do not be afraid.'" The Lord Jesus reassured them with these words, "Have courage, it is I, do not be afraid." The most repeated command in the Bible, do not be afraid, is held up along with the name of God. It is I am in the Greek. The contrast could not be so clear. The definitions of this world and the definitions of God are not in concert. The setting screams, which is bigger, our storms or our God? It was at this point that the Lord Jesus got into the boat with the disciples, and the disciples were absolutely blown away. You see, it wasn't until they heard his voice that they recognized who he was. They were fearful because they depended solely on what they saw with their eyes. When the Lord Jesus spoke, they recognized his voice. The Lord Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice and they follow me." So it was at this point that the Lord Jesus got into the boat. For the disciples, it was a total failure. For the second time, their eyes were opened in a new way. What we think is failure is often seen differently by God. Trusting in the God of the Bible is never a mistake because he uses every ounce of our existence, our experiences, our pain for our good and his glory. In verses 51 and 52 of today's passage, we read, "Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind became calm." The followers were greatly amazed. They did not understand about the miracle of the 5 loaves because their minds were closed. There are times when the Lord Jesus gives us his promises and he sends us into awful situations. And those situations are designed to hone our heart's ability to see him for ourselves. As a result, we see him more clearly than we did before, for ourselves. It is then that we find ourselves believing his promises more strongly, because it is only in the midst of those horrible times that we discover the substance of his words. That night on that dark sea, The disciples initially concluded the wrong thing about the Lord, but eventually they saw the Lord for who he was. The passing of time was necessary. This is how he works with us, as he trains our hearts to see him. The Lord Jesus Christ, this holy God, stands in contrast to this unholy world we live in. Because of sin, we live in a world of death. Most of our lives are spent trying to get what we don't have and trying to repair the damage of our brokenness. But the only cure for our brokenness is a revelation of a holy God who lacks nothing and who has promised to supply all of our needs. It is on this basis of his promises and in the context of our trials that this process happens. We must be in the habit of trusting him and watching him work in our lives masterfully. And as a result, our hearts will be changed. My friends, I trust this blog and this podcast are helpful to you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, shoot me an email at BYoungMinistry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great day.